The value of philosophy is, in fact, to be sought largely in its very uncertainty. In this episode of Philosophers Explained, we turn to Bertrand Russell, who was the most famous philosopher in the world during the 20th century. In this work, The Value of Philosophy, we turn to a 1912 book in which it appears, in which Russell summarizes the results of fundamental issues in philosophy and then asks what the point or purpose of philosophy is given those findings. Let's go to the text. Focusing on the chapter The Value of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. It comes from a book called The Problems of Philosophy, and I want to start by looking at the table of contents to see the range of issues that Russell discusses first, and on the basis of the conclusions reached there, deciding what the value of philosophy is. And all of these are core issues, fundamental issues in philosophy, in metaphysics and epistemology. So, chapter 1, the distinction between appearance and reality, what appears to be the case, but what is real, that distinction. Whether we can establish the existence of matter outside of our minds. If we can do so, can we establish the nature of that matter? If we cannot do either of those things, considering the possibility that all of reality is ideal, or the stuff of ideas, that is to say, not material or not physical. Some issues with respect to empirical approaches to philosophy, starting knowledge on the basis of being acquainted or perceiving, sensing, and something like that, reality, and then knowing things by means of abstract words and descriptions, whether we can connect those two by inducing from things we are acquainted with, coming up with general principles or not. If not, trying to explain where we do get these universal concepts or universal principles or universal ideas, what our knowledge, if any of those, consists in. Then some questions about knowledge at the foundational level of intuitions, distinction between truth and falsehood. If we're not certain, talking about knowledge in contrast to errors, in contrast to probabilities and bare possibilities. And on the basis of that, establishing what are the limits to what we can in fact do in philosophy. Having done all of that, Russell in the final chapter turns to the question then of the value of philosophy. And it's going to be a poignant question for Russell because he is an advocate of philosophy, but it seems at the beginning of the 20th century that philosophy has reached some disquieting conclusions about its project and the feasibility of the philosophical project. So let's turn to his assessment here. All right. Having now come to the end of our brief and very incomplete review of the problems of philosophy, it will be well to consider in conclusion what is the value of philosophy. And Russell is aware that that's an important question. Why are we spending all of this time on it? But also that Russell is aware that for the lay reader, intelligent people who are not necessarily philosophers, that they have a certain reputation or a certain view of what philosophy is all about. Many men, under the influence of science or of practical affairs, are inclined to doubt whether philosophy is anything better than innocent but useless, trifling, hair-splitting distinctions and controversies on matters concerning which knowledge is impossible. So what are we going to say in defense of philosophy or in advocacy of philosophy, keeping in mind that reputation of philosophy? So Russell goes on then to say, if the study of philosophy has any value at all for others than the students of philosophy, it must be only indirectly through its effects upon the lives of those who study it. So, of course, if you're a student of philosophy or you're a philosopher, you are into philosophy intrinsically or for its own sake. But what about all of the other people? What will the value be? It has to be indirect in some way, Russell is suggesting here. Now, to see this indirect value, we must first free our minds from the prejudices of what are wrongly called practical men. So the idea here that we want to know what the value is here, now, show me the money, show me the practical results in the next 2 minutes, or I'm not going to pay attention. We have to get out of that mindset. Instead of these focusing on here and now practical concerns, worldly concerns, Russell says, it is exclusively among the goods of the mind that the value of philosophy is to be found. Now, the word exclusively is important here because that is to say it excludes anything outside of the mind. It's only inside of the mind, mental, psychological, perhaps spiritual, depending on how we use that word. That's where we are going to find the value of philosophy. All right, so now getting more specific, well, philosophy, like all other studies, aims primarily at knowledge. Of course, yes, the quest for knowledge, and hopefully that knowledge, if it's of the important big issues, we can achieve even perhaps a kind of wisdom. And that might be the highest aspiration of philosophy. Philosophy etymologically means the love of wisdom, and philosophers are lovers of wisdom and the knowledge that is going to contribute to that wisdom. But here we run into the first big problem that Russell has to face now. It cannot be maintained that philosophy has had any very great measure of success in its attempts to provide definite answers to its questions. So this is now in the final chapter, and Russell has gone through a large sequence of fundamental philosophical questions and has reached uncertain conclusions with respect to all of them. But it's not that we have acquired knowledge, insight, understanding, or wisdom on any of them. And so we have to grapple now with this fact. There are many questions which, so far as we can see, must remain insoluble to the human intellect unless its powers become of quite a different order from what they are now. And that's a very sobering conclusion to reach for a 20th century philosopher to reach after over 2.5 millennia of philosophical knowledge seeking. We have the most famous philosopher in the world summarizing what philosophy has achieved so far, and to say it's not only that we haven't achieved knowledge in any of these areas, in fact, those problems, those questions are unanswerable. They are insoluble. If we think of all of the geniuses who have cracked their brains against these issues, they even are not smart enough. So it's going to take, if even then, a kind of being, intelligent being with capacities beyond human capacities if those problems have a chance of being solved. So we have a negative set of conclusions. Philosophy can't answer any of its questions so far, but then a stronger kind of skepticism. In fact, those questions are unanswerable. We can't know the answer to any of them. That is repeated a few lines later. The answers suggested by philosophy are none of them demonstrably true. So what we then need to do is face up to a harsh realization. We cannot therefore include as part of the value of philosophy any definite set of answers to such questions. Philosophy is not going to give you answers. It's not going to give you knowledge. And so if we are interested in the value of philosophy, we have to go look somewhere else. Hence, once more, the value of philosophy must not depend upon any supposed body of definitely ascertainable knowledge. So then the question is going to be, well, what's the point, right? If we're interested in knowledge, that's what whole philosophy is supposed to be about. Well, forget philosophy, just set it aside. And there are lots of other areas, perhaps physics, chemistry, the sciences, history, and so forth, where we can go if we are interested in knowledge. Philosophy has just shown itself to be a waste of time. But here Russell wants to save the day some for philosophy. The value of philosophy is, in fact, to be sought largely in its very uncertainty. So, life hands you lemons, make lemonade. If philosophy can't give us answers, make its unanswerability into a virtue. And here's how we might try to do that. Philosophy, though unable to tell us with certainty what is the true answer to the doubts which it raises, is able to suggest many possibilities which enlarge our thoughts and free them from the tyranny of custom. So the first point then is to say most of us are born into a certain society, into a certain family, into a certain way of doing things, and we are perhaps only exposed to that one way of doing things. So one thing that philosophy can do is expand our minds to consider other customs, other ways of doing things, other ways of looking at things. It's not going to give you a certain answer that one way is truer or better than the other, but it's going to expand your mind. And that will be a positive value for philosophy. And it probably then, in the course of doing so, will undermine the confidence or certainty that you had growing up that your families, your cultures, your civilization's way of doing things are the right way of doing things. So it's going to undermine those certainties, but that too is a value. Thus, while diminishing our feeling of certainty as to what things are, it greatly increases our knowledge as to what they may be. It removes the somewhat arrogant dogmatism of those who have never traveled into the region of liberating doubt, and it keeps alive our sense of wonder by showing familiar things in an unfamiliar aspect. All right, now that's an interesting point because certainly the philosophical mindset has traditionally opposed kind of narrow-mindedness, dogmatism, particularly dogmatism that's based on ignorance of other possibilities, and so philosophy can be a useful corrective here. It's an interesting question, though, about why, even supposing that is a value, why we need philosophy for doing so, because we could suggest, for example, that science will do all of that. Just go and study science, and that certainly is going to enlarge your sense of what is possible out there, all of those different scientific hypotheses and so forth. And literature is another possibility. We can read literary studies from different cultures and different characters and different plot lines and themes and so forth. So we don't necessarily need philosophy. We can get all of that mind expansion through literature, and possibly even in combinations of those. Take science fiction literature. So all of those reimaginings, perhaps, of the way the world is in different galaxies and messing around with the laws of physics and all of those thought experiments. All of those can perform this function without necessarily philosophy. So maybe at most what we would then say is philosophy, like some of these other things, can perform this valuable service of enlarging our minds. Russell wants to go on to argue for another value to philosophy despite its lack of success and despite its uncertainties. He says here, the private world of instinctive interests is a small one, set in the midst of a great and powerful world which must, sooner or later, lay our private world in ruins. In ordinary life, he goes on to say, in such a life there is no peace, but a constant strife between the insistence of desire and the powerlessness of will. In one way or another, if our life is to be great and free, we must escape this prison and this strife. So here what Russell is doing is asking us to consider the life, the actual life of the vast majority of human beings. A small world, a private world, but it's a world that in which one is powerless and full of strife and conflict, and one in which you are, or one is eventually just going to lose, right? It's going to come to ruin. So we have a certain pessimistic understanding of the way most people's lives are, according to Bertrand Russell. So what can philosophy then possibly do, given that that's the nature of life for the vast majority of people? Can it provide some value here. And here Russell sounds a traditional theme, the kind of the consolations of philosophy, that life, real life nonetheless, might not be that great, that wonderful. It's not that childhood romantic adventure that we all thought about. Real life is it's messy, it's petty, it's full of strife, it's full of disappointments, that perhaps as a consolation prize, philosophy can rescue us, at least partially, from that kind of life. And Russell goes on to sound that theme next. One way of escape is by philosophical contemplation. So philosophy is a kind of escape from the unpleasantness of ordinary life. Because what one does when one enters into the philosophical mindset is it views the whole impartially. So that is to say, you get away from the private and get to the impersonal. You get away from the local and the particular to a perspective on the whole. You get away from me, and my values and my worries and my concerns to an impartial stance. And getting yourself into that state is a value of philosophy. All acquisition of knowledge is an enlargement of the self. And what we have here to point out is the self is capitalized here. So it's not the small s self, which is kind of the you, the individual self, and with your small, local, petty concerns and worries. Rather, it is an enlarged self, a grander self, a self that has a more universal, impartial perspective on the cosmos and everything that is in it. We set aside all other interests and we achieve this self. It is obtained when the desire for knowledge is alone operative. So we set everything else aside, all of our other values, all of our other interests. The desire for knowledge alone is operative. One is in a different psychological space. This contemplation, or thus contemplation, enlarges us, not only the objects of our thoughts, but also the object of our actions and our affections. It makes us citizens of the universe. We get out of our private minds, we get outside of our families, outside of our villages, outside of our nations. We become citizens of the universe, as close as we possibly get to being at one with the cosmos and so forth. Thus, to sum up our discussion of the value of philosophy, and here's the conclusion: philosophy is to be studied not for the sake of any definite answers to its questions, since no definite answers can, as a rule, be known. Now, just as a comment, this is a work that was published in 1912, so it's right at the beginning of the 20th century. And what we find is Russell, who had great esteem by virtually all philosophers, even philosophers who disagreed with him on all sorts of issues. And so he has a certain stature in the world and eventually becomes like the grand old man of philosophy. And that puts him in a position then to be speaking for all of philosophy. And that's what he thinks he is doing here. Philosophy has no answers. It has tried for millennia, and it has failed repeatedly to give answers that are demonstrable, certain, or can in any way be known to be true. This is a very deep skepticism, which is to say, knowledge is impossible. You note that he says not only that have we not come up with any answers, he wants to say in principle, these are insoluble problems. We cannot come up with answers to these questions. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the world of philosophy, at least the part of the large majority of the world of philosophy that is by and large esteeming Bertrand Russell and his approaches, is in a skeptical place. I want to go to one short appendix that Russell included at the end of The Problems of Philosophy, the book, and this comes after the chapter on the value of philosophy, and it's called the Bibliographic Note. And here Russell has some book recommendations for people who want to read further and to study philosophy further. And Russell's book has been widely adopted in introduction to philosophy classes all over the world, all through the 20th century. And so it makes sense for him to make recommendations to students for further reading. The student who wishes to acquire an elementary knowledge of philosophy will find it both easier and more profitable to read some of the works of the great philosophers than to attempt to derive an all-round view from the handbook. So if you want to get past the textbooks and all the secondary and tertiary sources and so forth and get back to the original philosophers, here are the greatest of the great philosophers that I, Bertrand Russell, recommend you look at next. And just a quick glancing down the list, he recommends Plato, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Berkeley, Hume, and Kant. So we have the big seven from Russell's perspective in the entire history of philosophy. But it's also interesting to note what names are not on Russell's list. For example, if we notice Plato, whom I have highlighted here, Plato from the ancient world is recommended, but nothing from Aristotle. Aristotle does not make the list. And so it's interesting that Plato, as a more rationalistic, idealistic philosopher, is on the list, but Aristotle, the more naturalistic and empirical philosopher, is not on the list. And I think that says something about where Russell thinks the better value of philosophy is to be found. It's not in this naturalistic empiricist Aristotelian tradition, it's more in the Platonic idealist and rationalist tradition. We see that the next three thinkers are all early modern thinkers: René Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. And in the classical canon of philosophy, all of these are rationalistic thinkers. But it's interesting then again that we do not get from that era the early modern empiricist philosophers recommended. There's no mention here of Francis Bacon. There's no mention here of John Locke. So then again, I think we can read from this that Russell does think there is value in the early modern rationalist tradition, but not in the early modern empiricist tradition. The next two figures, Berkeley and Hume, are later in the empiricist tradition, but they represent kind of a dead end that empiricism had gotten to. Berkeley, with his metaphysical idealism, arguing that in fact we cannot believe that the world out there, if there is a world out there, is physical or material. Instead, the entire world is ideas and the stuff of ideas and minds. So a thoroughgoing idealism and a retreat from any sort of physicalism or materialism. And Hume is another empiricist, but he is has a deserved reputation for being a deep skeptic about the possibility of knowledge in any possible area. Kant is then also mentioned, and Kant, of course, has to be on anyone's list of great philosophers one has to read. Kant is attempting to put a synthesis together and perhaps a new way of doing philosophy given the failings of both the rationalist and the empiricist traditions up to his time. All right, so point here is that Russell, speaking for philosophy at the early part of the 20th century, is reaching a skeptical place. And in order to understand why philosophy has gotten to a skeptical place, the best philosophers he thinks to read are these ones here. One final note, we do in our Philosophers Explained series have episodes on Plato, Descartes, Hume, and Kant, so feel welcome to check those out for more details.